Hey everyone, Steger here, and welcome to the city of Hunterville in City Skylines. In the last episode, we were working on modifying this river and built out some of these suburbs here, as well as a little pathway along the river. And in today's episode, I want the main focus to be on building a large city park over in this area of the city, along where this little river is, just on the edge of what will eventually be the downtown once we expand out the sort of inner city core. And we'll also do some suburbs and things too, just around this area. And to get started, we're building out one of the main roads that will go along the northern bank of the river and sort of form the northern boundary of the city park that we're going to build later in the episode. So here I just took the 4-lane avenue and was trying to work out how to get it to come around these corners, decide if I want little straight bits in between, and just using network multi-tool to get that achieved. And here we're dragging out another main road that heads off in a different direction, a bit more parallel to the direction of the river, whereas the other one was heading a bit inland. And then coming through and doing some grids for residential streets. I was trying a little bit to figure out the spacing of these, since this is a lot more closely spaced than some of the other grids in the city. And then again, more grids, but this time following the angle of the other road and creating a little bit of weird interface between how the two grids meet. But we managed to make it work, and I think I come back in a second or two and change the angle of one of those roads that currently doesn't intersect with the road next to it. That's this one here, and just using network multi-tool to create a little curve to connect these two roads. There's still that sharp bit on the other side, but I think we managed to make it work later in the episode with fitting houses in there. Then just coming over next to the area we built in the last episode and filling out a couple more blocks of housing, and I've included some little row homes there that you probably didn't really get enough time to comprehend what was going on, but just adding those in to vary up the architecture in the area a little bit. As at the time they were built, there probably wasn't like a single family zoning that allowed only low-rise houses, so townhouses might have been fine then, and the population might have seen it as a good option to use land and get people living close to town. And here just coming through along the river and building some houses with backlot sections to kind of build out towards the river a bit. I didn't really want full-on streets in this location, as I still wanted to keep a little bit of space between the riverbank and the edge of properties and things, just in case of flooding and things. People might have not seen that desirable to build there. And here just coming through on that main road, this is between what we just built in the area of the last episode, and just building out a few shops and things to create a small town centre. Nothing massive, there's not even a supermarket here or any malls or anything, it's just a few local shops. But I also decided to put an apartment building on this corner and just fit a few shops around it, as this is still relatively close to the city and there would be demand to live this close to town. Plus, when I do expand out the downtown, I don't exactly know the extent of what that's going to cover, so it might extend all the way out into this area anyway. But for now, just using some lower rise buildings to create the little town centre there. And then moving over further away from the city, here's some more housing zoning. I think this is the same style of buildings as I was using in the previous blocks, and just expanding this out, but this block is a little bit wider and it accommodates the backlot sections. I mentioned this in other videos, but I never liked the 4-cell deep building sizes in City Skylines 1, and having backlots was somewhat of my solution to that. And then we're going to move over to the river and expand out some more houses along here. Here I'm just going for single house depth housing, and then add in a little dead-end street out here just to squeeze a few more houses in, as the river is kind of now going away from that street, so there's more space, but still leaving plenty of space behind to fit everything else in. And here just going through with the terraforming network, This is to create like a stop bank so the area doesn't flood from the river, and then coming through with the standard vanilla pedestrian path and just tweaking that a little bit. I spent a little bit of time off camera creating little jut outs and curves that made this not so straight and more of like a leisurely path, but I'm not showing all that because it was a lot of messing around with network multi-tool. But you can see it here, there's a little curve there. But now coming through with the forest brush and just adding in some trees. Here I'm going for the medium height tree, and then we'll come back with some smaller trees and fill in some of the gaps along here. As you can see now, there's just little odd bits that forest brush didn't quite get to because of the hit zone and various other things. And then coming through and working on another block. This is transitioning into the next suburb over. There's going to be a separate town centre for this area, but this is largely similar to the other block. I think the houses might be slightly wider and being 3x3 rather than 2x3 or 2x4. And fitting in some backlots here due to the unusual block size, and filling in the awkward little gaps that are left from not having a square grid with some trees. And here we're starting on the town centre. This is actually my first iteration that I didn't keep, but we've got a gas station there, which I think is the Hunterville gas station made by Ali Targas, based off a BP gas station in a small town in New Zealand called Hunterville, which is where I sort of came up with the name of the city from. And then just putting down some other shops and things, trying to work out what would fit in here. So that was this building here, that fit in the gap, and then I was trying to work out what else would fit, and ended up just mirroring this building with procedural objects. But this didn't face such a great fate, as now I'm coming through and deleting all this, as I didn't actually like that much how it turned out. This was recorded a while ago, so I don't know the exact reasoning for it, but just coming through again and picking out some different buildings this time. I think that really white one, I used procedural objects and the text function to just make sort of black boxes that were half transparent to make the textures a bit more bearable, and the roof actually have some sort of color rather than just this like bright white color. And then on the other side of the street I came through, and on this block I actually broke the grid a little bit to extend out the commercial front a bit more, and then have a road running parallel to the main road connecting in between those two streets, so that there's not a dead end. And here's just a little New Zealand post shop for people to send their mail and things. I can't remember if it actually works in game with the Industries DLC function. I'd have to check that. But just a few more shops along here, and then finishing us off with a corner pub, I think. I kind of wanted to line up this building with the facade of those other buildings that ended up coming through in procedural objects, and converting that building into procedural objects, and then manipulating the design of that building. And then we come through and just add a little bit of detailing at the back. It's not too extensive, it's just a couple of dumpsters and some sort of cracked details on the empty areas of pavement. Anyway, I should also mention that this town centre is going to be right across the road from the large park, which we're going to build in a few minutes time in this video. And yeah, here just finishing off a little bit of detailing, and then coming through, skipping over like half of the residential building stuff, but here we're just adding a few more houses along the road that fronts the riverbank, and putting in some backlots here, and then trying to fit in a house on this little corner, which requires a bit more attention as it's not just a square or rectangular block, so just adding in trees there. And then now we're coming over to the end of that road and adding a parking lot. This will be for part of the large park, probably mainly for parking of people watching their kids' sports games, since there'll be sport there. And then we're coming through and extending this pathway along the riverfront that we've been working on both in this episode and extending through the area we worked on in the last episode, and then coming through with the forest brush and adding the last few details to this, which includes some trees, and then on this edge where the stop bank gets a little bit closer to the river, I change it up for these smaller tree clusters. And finally filling in this area to the back of the path with a few small trees and things. So now we've got a few little suburban areas completed, including this town centre that we built earlier. We've also got many more houses now around this part of the city, as well as that other town centre there. And in between the last recording, I also built out some more roads. I'm not showing that in the time-lapse though. So we've got more suburban grid network here for future houses, as well as this road that runs along the train station and the stadium comes past here and then merges straight back into this main road. For now, I've built a straight road to fit the houses onto as how they might have been built in the past, and this would have been at a weird angle. And then for the sake of future retrofitting, we've also got this curve here, which would be how the road was realigned to form a better intersection. We've also got this road connecting through here now. This will form one of the borders of the park, and then this road heads out in this direction away from the city. So now we're moved on to starting on the park. This location is wedged between the riverbank and the southernmost road that cuts through the park. And here we're just connecting up a little pathway from the suburb that we just built into the road across the river, building a bridge across there, and that will connect somewhere out into the suburbs in the future. And then once that was completed, I decided to come through and do some vegetation detailing between the riverbank and this pathway here. And here I'm just putting in some ruin texture to emulate where people might have been traveling down through all that vegetation to get to the river for fishing or other things. And then I decided to add some basketball courts in this area, conveniently located next to the parking areas. If this was used by kids, and their parents could park there and drop them off and watch them do their school sports and things. And as you saw there, I came through with a few benches next to the basketball courts for a little bit of seating for the audience, and didn't do too much with that. It was just pretty straightforward. But now we're coming up and finishing up the pathways in this area. I connected another pathway up to the main road and am now coming through and adding in some lighting. Off camera, I did do a bit more work and checked that it actually seemed right, the lighting levels with the nighttime view. And so now we're moving over to building this house. My thoughts here are that this has been turned into a cafe or a restaurant. I don't know whether the city would have put this here or whether some rich millionaire or something wanted to establish a cafe here and then decided to spend the money to move this old house into this location. Perhaps that house was otherwise earmarked for demolition to be replaced with apartments or more higher density living in the area where it was built, because it's like quite an old sort of Victorian 1900s style house, so that area might have been marked for development in the city. Anyway, let me know down in the comments section what you think the backstory for that cafe should be. Just note that the city is based in New Zealand, so people from Australia and New Zealand establishing the place might fit a little bit better into the storyline. I also added in the Park Life restroom asset, one from one of the Park Life themes I don't remember, just to add a bit more for the amenity of the area. And here, coming through and adding some abutments to this bridge with these concrete props, and I make this look easy, but it really wasn't, and it was a lot of trial and error, but I'm kind of just showing a snippet of that. And then along the side here, we're coming through and just adding some more trees and things. Revisiting this Hunterville gas station asset made by LA Tigers, because I didn't end up placing it in that suburb. I initially used it in the last section, but then I redid that whole area and removed it, so I wanted to find a new place to put it, so I put it there. I also added in some other park asset, which is like a big playground or something, and just scattered some additional benches around that area too for like families, so they can come have a picnic and then the kids can play at the playground and then they can go on their way. And we're almost completed this small section of the park, and the last few things I did was just add in a few more benches and connect up the pathway from beside the basketball courts to the rest of the path network. And then off camera I added in a small gravel path and a few trees on the other side of the riverbank. So before we get into the time lapse, I just thought that I would give you some idea of where I was taking inspiration from the city park from. The first place is Queen Elizabeth Park in the small town of around 20,000 people called Masterton in New Zealand. This is in the area of New Zealand where I actually grew up, so I've been to this park quite a few times as a child and was using that as one inspiration. Also, it's probably a similar scale, the surrounding area, to what I'm trying to achieve in City Skylines, so it's a good reference point for that. The second park is Cornwall Park in the inner suburbs of Auckland. This is also quite a large park, partly centred around one of the volcanic cones of One Tree Hill. And the third notable New Zealand city park that I wanted to mention is Hagley Park in Christchurch. If you look at the way I've got this laid out, I've kind of got the park in Hunterville laid out in a similar way, focusing around a river. Plus, I intend to have a northern section and southern section separated by a road, so it would be similar in those ways. Plus, I lived in Christchurch for a couple of years, so I'm relatively familiar with this park and was using it as a lot of the inspiration. And in the time-lapse, we're now building a path around the edge of this section of the park, mostly following the riverbanks of the small river that goes through here. At one point, I have the path almost hugging the riverbank, coming up really close. And then we've also got 3 different bridges on this part of the park that connect between the park and the roads on the other side. And at one of those bridges, I decided to start building things here, placing down a few tables and trees. But there was also this space up in one part of the park where there's an intersection of two roads, and I decided to focus on that section next, and instead of building out parkland like we are going to be doing in the rest of this area, I decided to add a few commercial buildings along this street. As it's quite close to the downtown, we've got a mix of like very small 1 or 2 story low density commercial up to maybe one building that's about 8 stories or something like that. So it really creates a bit of variety in this area and implies that people want to be developing here because it's close to the CBD. Also adding a little parking lot in here. This space is like almost too small to fit buildings in, as it's very close to the river, so I decided that I would add a parking lot here as it also serves the immediate businesses plus that office building, and probably was needed for their parking minimums or something at the time. Just has one little entrance there, and then spent way more time than it looks building that retaining wall around the car park just to make it all blend in nicely with the riverbank. I mean, it's not the most spectacular thing, it's just like some concrete wall next to some river, but that is what happens in built up environments sometimes, is that you get something ugly like that. And then just coming through and adding a few more shops right up here. I kind of wish I made an angled building on this corner, but I ended up just choosing that like 2 or 3 story pub building and then creating some table and chairs out in the sort of tightest part of that corner to utilize the space, and then came through as well with some planters and some trees to finish off this area. And moving back to the actual park area, here we're just starting to build out a small looping walking path in this area that breaks off from the main pathway and just fills in the space a little bit. Put a gazebo down and a few trees here and things just to try and fill out this area. It's a little awkwardly shaped, and you do sort of see like the back alley of those shops a little bit if you're looking carefully from that area, I guess. And then just adding in a few trees, and then we're going to move over to building some rugby fields. In New Zealand, rugby is quite a big deal, so I decided to create a set of rugby fields here. We do have a rugby club on the other side of the city, somewhat into the hills, but I decided that here would be a good place to have another one, plus there's plenty of space here, and I was honestly struggling to come up with ideas as to how to fill this space, but looking around various city parks, quite a few of them do use a lot of the space for sports fields, so it isn't not realistic, but I feel like in this episode it might be a little too weighted on sports fields, but I do expand on expanding the park further than what I'd built by the end of this episode, so maybe that style could change up a bit. And here just adding a parking lot, I also added in a few mobility parking spaces, I'm not exactly sure how many. And then coming through here and finishing off the ends of these so that there's space for the car to reverse into the end bit and then drive forward out. And then after this, I fill in those empty spaces with some ploppable asphalt. I don't quite like the way that the ends of these parking lot roads curve, but there's not really any way to resolve that. Even using node controller, it still has somewhat of a curve. And then just creating a line of trees as the border between the rugby field and the car park, and then dragging out these paths here to provide another connection without having to go all the way onto the main road. And I think off camera I did add lines of trees on each side of that pathway, so it creates like a nice canopy under the trees to walk down. And now we're actually going to be starting on a tennis club, so another sort of sporting club located in this area. I came through, plopped down a couple of tennis courts, and utilized that building that I had sitting there from when I originally started building out the park before I switched over to building the commercial area. So using that, and as well I'm using this, I think it's a like modern cafe or something from Green Cities, but I could be wrong. It's been a while since I actually did this episode, so I might be getting mixed up. But using that there as part of the club rooms or as a separate building, and then just having some tables and chairs outside. And continuing with that theme, we're also adding in some planters and some trees, and in a second I go through and scatter some tables in amongst this big shaded but also concreted area. I mean, this area could use for some decals, but it's kind of something I overlooked just given the amount of concrete, just to change things up a bit. And then to finish off this area, I just added in a few more trees around the place to fill in the empty patches of grass and sort of mask it from some of the main walkways. And with the main clubroom area of the tennis club done, we're now moving to the other side of the main pathway that somewhat splits the park into two, and adding in these 4 more tennis courts here, kind of tucking them closer to that car park, and also ensuring there's some concrete surfacing to emulate pathways between the 2 parts of the tennis club. And here we're coming through with some trees just to kind of separate out the 2 different halves of the park a little bit more. And then these paths will form sort of a border around a central lawn in the park that might accommodate concerts and some farmers markets or something. And then we're starting off to build this accessway to a new car parking area. I also included in this section the road markings for the intersection. Here I'm just leaving it as if the road isn't really an intersection but rather a driveway, and you've got that mid-block pedestrian crossing right there that serves for pedestrians, so turn the pedestrian crossings off in the intersection itself. And then we're moving over the car park, and there's some height differences around this area, so the layout is kind of split into 2 tiers, with one being lower to the ground and one being higher up, and there's a little landscape section in between the 2 tiers of car parking. And off camera I did add in some trees in that little green section in between, and then here just coming down, adding more trees to further separate out the different paths and just add landscaping and keep it in with that environment of like this is a parkland rather than just some random car park. And then we came through on the slope and added some grasses at the base, and then added trees over the top before moving on to start working on a cafe building here. And I imagine for the history for this might be that it is an old club room for one of the various sports teams that have training grounds here, perhaps an old rugby club room that was designed like a house back in the day. And since things have changed in the park, the rugby club maybe has a different club room, which you'll see me build in a few minutes time. And this building has since been converted into a park cafe where people can come and have a nice lunch sitting out in the park. The view of this from the seating area isn't actually that great since it's blocked by those hedges there, but we have got quite a few outdoor seating and tables, and here I was coming through with this tunnel entrance prop by Ronix and using that as a concrete decking area for the outdoor seating, as there's a little bit of height differences here and it didn't make sense to have that all just follow the terrain, as it actually kind of slopes down the hill gradually towards the river and towards some other vegetated areas that I'll add in a minute. And here we're also adding in some steps, and then I come through and add these glass railings so that people don't like step over a ledge that's too far down, and just adding these through to mark the edge of the area. And then on a side to that, we add in some play equipment beside the cafe for the kids. We do have a playground in the other section of the park on the other side of one of the main roads, but just adding in something little here for the cafe area, and then coming through and adding in some grasses here with only a few trees in this area so as not to block any views from the cafe. And with the completion of that cafe, we're now moving over to the area of the park closest to one of the main roads and building a man-made lake here. And to adjust the shape of this, I'm using Node Controller with the terraforming networks rather than trying to do this with the inbuilt terraforming tools, and then just coming around and adding some trees around here. Even to this date though, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the water levels in that, since the ground is quite of a gentle slope and there's no hard banks on that lake. There is a little bit of flooding going on, and also around there I added a few picnic tables in for people that might want to sit there. And here we're coming back to that central lawn and just adding in some dirt decals. I lowered them into the ground to fade them out so that it appears like general wear from people using the area and wearing down the grass. And here we're using this gym asset from, I think it's Green Cities DLC. And this is intended to be the current club room for the rugby club. I know earlier in the episode I mentioned that that cafe building might have been the old club room, and this is perhaps its replacement with a second story gym or something, and then areas for gathering. And I did also add some stairs and a few planters around the front of that at the entrance, since it's also on a bit of a slope and a little bit offset from the pathway. And here we're coming through and adding the final rugby field in this part of the park. And then I switched things up a bit to add in a few basketball courts in a sort of separate club area. This also required adding a retaining wall, as there is also a little bit of slope here. I mean, the whole area is on a slope, but just coming in with these retaining walls, and I tidied them up with Node Controller to make the edges of the walls connect, and moved it over here and just plopped a few trees down. Then we're going to move back over to the rugby field and actually add in some grandstands. So we've got one on each side here. I also put in some effort, I don't think I showed on camera, to ensure that the rugby field is as flat as it can possibly be within the limitations of some of the terraforming things going on here. We also shifted some little sheds at the back of those grandstands by converting the whole thing to procedural objects, just to get them to line up with the terrain differences, and then added in a small storage shed for the basketball court. And here we're just coming through and adding some final vegetation around that area before shifting to the other side of the river and along the road that forms a boundary to this whole park area. We're just placing down a gravel path that kind of meanders through that space, with a couple of trees alongside here, and in a second I go through and add a few tables in some of the areas just for people passing by can stop and have their lunch there. And that basically wraps up the building portion of this episode. But if you've got any sort of backstories that you're thinking about some of the rugby clubs, I'd love to hear them down in the comments. So now I've completed this section of the city park, and let me know what you think of it down in the comments, and leave a like on this video if you've enjoyed the video building process. Here we've got this tennis club, many tennis fields, I think there's about 8 of them, a basketball club here I think, yes, basketball. Various pathways and things going around the river, as well as some rugby fields and things there too. The pathways extend all along this riverbank, so you can go on the outside, and for the most part it's separate pathways except for this little section here where you just gotta walk on the sidewalk of that avenue, and then picking up again through here and a big loop track on around the perimeter of the inside of the park flanked by the river. And here's this lake here. You can see the ground texture changed because there's a little bit of flooding onto these streets, which I still haven't resolved. And the earlier section of the park, I think these are netball courts. I think in the time lapse I might have said basketball, or I might have corrected myself. And then just a little blank space here. It didn't really need to anything done with it. Some empty space is acceptable. And the main playground of the park is here. And there's a few other things like this cafe, which I went through on the time lapse. And in the future episodes, I want to extend out this park from what it is currently, going from here and all through here, up into this section here. I'm not sure how much further it will extend up here because we're already getting close to where the train line's going to go, which is roughly about where the existing bit of train line is. And then for a wider overview, including the suburb we worked on at the beginning of the episode, we go from about where my cursor is now out all the way to the city park. And just to give you a wider overview in the context of the whole city, that park is actually reasonably large in the scale of what I've built out so far, so that's some good progress we've made in this episode. But anyway, on that note, if you've enjoyed this one, then thanks, and if you've made it to this mark in the video, then I appreciate it. This was quite a long one, so thanks for sticking around, and until next time, take care. Bye.